I'm going to miss Sir Jim, and I know he wasn't a fan of knighthoods, but when we met, I told him he'd been Prime Minister for 7 years, and I was going to call him Sir. We compromised on once a day, and so that's my one done. Jim grew up on the farm in Taranaki, just down the road from my mum's family, and I first met him actually at my grand's funeral. He'd been a bit busy during my teenage years running the country, but I remember thinking it was pretty cool that just recently retired Prime Minister would turn up to my grand's funeral. But the thing I learned about him, and Joan to be fair, is that they always took the time. If Mum or Uncle Brian were in town, they'd take the time. If I was calling in to visit but I had the kids, it was never a problem. They would take the time, a cup of tea, if it was after 3, maybe a glass of red wine, a loan of the tractor, of the trailer to take the greenways to the tip. In fact, when I was overseas with the Air Force for a few months, he got in touch suggesting that maybe he should go around and take all my greenways to the tip for me. I said there was no way I was having a former Prime Minister turn up and take my greenways to the tip. And I got home and saw how much there was and regretted that. But he was always making time for others, whether it was local events or both of my election nights. In fact, the last election, he'd sent me a message saying, look, he had all the family around, he wouldn't make it to our function. But Joan tells the story that, you know, an hour in as the results were coming in, he stood up and announced, right, we're off. And they came down and joined us at the Waikanae Bowls Club, and very fond memories. They were always making time for others. Still active right up until the end, helping our council, helping community groups, helping the local Catholic church, still enjoying frequent visits from the media. I'm not sure we always enjoyed them, but he certainly did. A good friend Chris Bishop was reminding us this morning that when he and Nicola came to run a public meeting with me just a few years ago, after they'd finished speaking, there was the usual Q&A. I don't know, maybe 5 minutes into the questions, Jim came to the front and gave what, with all due respect, I would now reminds me of committee of the whole speeches, because it wasn't really a question. There was no question mark at the end of it, and it went on for quite a while. But eventually the questions did start. It's just they were from the floor, not for Chris or Nicola, they were for Jim, and he was away. And do you know, I think most residents on the coast have been to a business breakfast or a public meeting that's been hosted by Jim. A lot of the time he hadn't been invited to host them, but inevitably that's where things ended up. But I just, you know, I think for people, and maybe my electorate has a slightly older average age than many, but I think they just shut their eyes and it took them back to the 90s. And while we joke about it, I think they felt safe. I saw how deeply respected he was and how deeply loved. There are many who will feel this loss far more keenly than I. I think of Joan, perhaps his greatest accomplishment in his 90-plus years. They were an amazing couple. In fact, when they found out one night that Emma, my wife, couldn't come with me to a National Party function, no, they were sending around the Bolger grandchildren to babysit. And from there on in, we were never short of babysitters. I'm not sure Emma appreciated losing the excuse to not turn up as much as Jim and Joan intended. But they always made the time. And do you know what? He was still blue to the core. Sometimes you had to scratch a little further, as we've heard in his later years, but he was blue to the core right until the end. The phone rang late on a Saturday night, just a couple of weeks ago. And I said to Emma, I'm not answering it, it's way too late. And then I saw whose name was on it. Okay, I'm answering it. You know, Jim always took the time for me, the regular text messages and phone calls. I would get a summons round to the house if we hadn't caught up for a couple of weeks. And we'd chat about the issues of the day, and I'd listen to many stories from his time at the top as well. Actually, often stories from his time as a minister under Muldoon. He'd talk about, you know, being sent overseas for 6 weeks with almost no accountability. It's fantastic, he said. And that's when he got to meet then Vice President George Bush Sr. But it was experiences like that that set him up for the first few years of his time as Prime Minister. He talked about being one of the only sort of small country leaders that had a direct line into the White House, and of course for his time as our ambassador to the US as well. But perhaps the story I remember the most leads me back to where I started, back in Taranaki. And he talked about, and I think it was 96, when people came to him and said, you know, what are we calling Mount Taranaki, or as it was then, Mount Egmont? You have to decide, Prime Minister, what's it going to be? Are we going to change from Egmont to Taranaki? And Jim, in I think his deep wisdom, said, just let people decide. If they want to call it Egmont, call it Egmont. If they want to call it Taranaki, call it Taranaki. But he could see the culture shift that was happening, and there was not just that deep wisdom, but that strategic patience in that. And I think it has been proven right 3 decades later. Jim knew that people needed time to adjust, that you can't force instant intergenerational change on people. It doesn't work. Big changes are made one step at a time, and they are far more effective if everyone takes one step together rather than just a few taking many. The challenges we face today are different, but they're kind of actually just the same. As he said, you don't win the battle to lose the war. You can avoid the battle and we can win the war together. And I think Jim won many times over. He won for Māori, he won for farmers, he won for a nuclear-free Pacific, he won for the man and woman on the street that he understood so well. He won for Kiwis. He was a leader. He was a leader that preferred to make the right decision over the popular one, who was willing to wait for the best outcome, not rush into the wrong one. And I think as a result, maybe he's one of our more underrated leaders, but also one of our more respected ones, both because of his values and because of the values that we all held as a nation. And perhaps there's a lesson in that for all of us. He taught me that when we enter this esteemed house, we need to move from protester to parliamentarian. That to be a true statesman and a leader takes patience as well as persistence. It takes grace and gravitas, conviction and compromise. It's not just about tearing down people in this house, but building up all of those that live outside of it. And so when I look at Mount Taranaki, I remember that Jim showed us a higher road, and maybe a little longer, maybe a little windier, maybe a little bumpier at times, but it has room for us all to journey together. And perhaps in this moment, even just for a moment, we can take one step along that road together towards the future that Jim wanted for his family and for ours. And to finish, to Jim's family in this sacred moment, we think not just of his contribution to country, but his commitment to family. Right back when you were all squeezed into that station wagon on those long drives home, and we send our love to all of you, and there really are a lot of you. But we send you our love as we mourn your granddad, your father, and your husband. Rest in peace, Jim.